Hello, my name is Troy Duskowski, and this is my presentation for the Things I Should Have Said essay. My situation is going to revolve around something that happened to me while I was in middle school. I grew up in the town of Clarkston, about an hour away from MSU, and I was a lower middle class minority student. I'm half African American, and Clarkston was a very upper class Caucasian town. It was over 90% white, and the middle school that I went to was the same way. There wasn't very many minority students. I was one of a very, very few. And the bus that I rode to school was the same way, mostly white students, and I was one of the few minorities. And there was a student on the bus who was part of the football team for Clarkston, and just like many other middle school and high schools, the football team's highly renowned. It's a huge part of the school and the culture. And one of the students on the football team that rode the bus used to throw racial epithets at me, racial slurs at me, and would just try to demean me on the bus. And eventually I brought the issue up to the assistant principal for the school, who's the one who handles the disciplinary measures for the school. And it just so happened that the assistant principal was also the football coach for the school. So you look at a football player and the football coach, the situation didn't exactly pan out well for me. And I brought in students who were on the bus who saw this happen and heard him say the things that he said, and they brought up to the principal, yeah, he said these things, and still nothing was done. The principal kind of just responded with, that's kind of the way people are going to be. That's kind of just the way it is. There's not much we can really do about it because we can't really be there to prove it, even though I had people saying that he said those things. And that's kind of what solidifies the situation as a social inequality situation versus the kid just being a jerk. The kid was a jerk, but what makes it kind of a social inequality piece is that it was kept in place and normalized by the assistant principal, who kind of said, there's nothing we can do about it, it's just kind of the way people are going to be. And the reason it was that way is because there was not many people from the racial minority camp saying, like, hey, this is bad, this can't keep going on. And there's people who, like, you don't want to have something being thrown against your football team, like, hey, one of your students is being racist, and you don't want that to kind of uproot your football team. So that kind of fits your functionalist versus conflict perspective on social inequality, where the status quo was kind of kept because it was the best way to do things, to where appeasing me, who was having this issue, wouldn't have been worth kind of uprooting everything that they had already built. It would have been easier to maintain the status quo versus trying to change things for the way that they should be instead of keeping things the way they are. And you kind of look at, again, your idea of institutionalized discrimination, where things are kept in place because they benefit one side and the other side just is kind of left to their own devices, and they kind of just have to deal with it. And that's kind of where you're looking at the situation from here, is that it's an institutionalized discrimination issue where the student had a level of social prestige that came with being in high school or being on a football team, and I just had to kind of deal with it because I didn't have a real position on the ladder. So the way that I dealt with the situation after it wasn't being handled was that I picked him up by his shirt and pushed him against the locker, and I told him to stop. And afterwards he did stop. The situation was then handled after that, but I was then disciplined for what I did, and I'm not mad about that. I mean, I handled things in a physical manner when things weren't physical. I mean, I understand why I got in trouble for that. But it kind of leads to that situation of, did I really have a choice in my decision that I made? And it's kind of an iffy one, because I could have just dealt with it. I could have just said, hey, I'm going to just deal with this kid saying the way he did. But I didn't want to do that. I didn't think it was right for me to have to do that. So I took the situation into my own hands, and I fixed the situation. And you kind of look at that, should I have handled it that way? Was that the right way to handle it? And that could always be argued, is that you look at people like Gandhi and Martin Luther King, who are people who think that nonviolence is always a way to answer things. And in general, I'm kind of the same way. I don't think violence solves a lot of issues. But there are some people you're just not going to reach. And I think the student is one of those people. And I think that the only way he was going to understand was through physical intimidation, like, hey, you can't just push me around. You're not bigger than me. I can handle you. And so it kind of brings up that agency versus structure debate of, you kind of look at a human being with free will. I could have chosen from an infinite number of options to do, but the situation that I was placed in, to get the result that I wanted, there weren't many options available. And I took the one that I thought was the most likely to get the outcome that I wanted, which was to not be bullied anymore. And so I took that option, and to this day I don't regret what I did. I don't know if it was exactly the right thing to do, but I don't regret it. But that's kind of where you look at the idea of it was a social inequality piece to where I was being handled a certain way because of my ethnicity, my race, and my social position. And he was the same way. He was a white upper class student. I was a black lower class student. And that's why I kind of created a social inequality piece and trying to maintain that status quo. And you always kind of look at there are multiple ways to handle a situation, but in some situations there's only one, and I handled the situation in that one way. So that's kind of my example of the whole thing, and I really thank you for listening, and I hope that this was educational in some way to anybody.